Shalom and welcome to the Middle East Report. In this programme today we'll be discussing how a medieval blood libel led to the establishment of East Anglia Friends of Israel. Warm welcome to the programme, and today I have two special guests. My first is Jill Gower, founder of East Anglia Friends of Israel. Welcome to the programme, Jill.
Thank you for having me.
Very welcome. And also very familiar to our viewers and to myself, Stephen Jaffe, co-chair of Northern Ireland Friends of Israel. So welcome to the programme.
Thank you, Simon.
Pleasure. I'll start off with you, Jill. Firstly, thank you so much for giving me the invitation to come and speak in May in Norwich on behalf of East Anglia Friends of Israel. I thought it was a fantastic evening. I saw many of our wonderful viewers there as well, including those who went on our tour to Israel in December. So I got some very special friends up there. But can you share with us how the Lord touched your heart and how you became a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ and how he laid a real passionate love for Israel and the Jewish people upon your heart?
I think once you become a Bible-believing Christian, how could you not understand God's purposes for Israel and for the Jewish people? After all, we're grafted in as Christians, we believe, to the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. And so it was just a natural thing for me. But I guess also I grew up in a very Jewish area, so my four best friends at school were Jewish. My parents' best friends were Jewish. In fact, I think my dad spent more time in a synagogue than he ever did in a church, to be honest. And funnily enough, in recent years, we found out that we actually had Jewish blood, and I'm probably a descendant of Moses Hart, who built the London synagogue that was bombed in the Blitz. So there's a great connection there, I think.
And how did that enable you or lead you to wanting to establish one of these very important organisations such as East Anglia Friends of Israel?
I think the stories of what happened in the war have always greatly affected me, and I think it's something that God has very much put in my heart. We have to do what's right, and we have to speak out. And the fact that people didn't speak out and the terrible things that happened during the Holocaust, I think that is such a blight on humanity. And when you follow God, you've got to stand up and you've got to speak out.
Absolutely. And Stephen, congratulations firstly for the incredible work that you've been involved in. You've been instrumental in helping to establish so many of these regional groups on behalf of Israel, and many of them made up of so many Christians throughout the country. Can you share with us the impact that these regional groups like East Anglia Friends of Israel are having in terms of mobilising support for the Jewish community and standing up for Israel in this nation?
Well, it's amazing to think, Simon, that prior to 2011, we didn't have any regional Friends of Israel groups, or very, very few. And today we have a network right across the country. We're hearing about East Anglia Friends of Israel today. We've also got groups everywhere from Scotland down in the north, down to Bournemouth Action for Israel and Sussex Friends of Israel. We've got groups, predominantly Jewish groups, for instance in Manchester, the Northwest Friends of Israel, or the Sussex Friends of Israel in Brighton, but all of them are bringing together Jews and Christians in different ways, and others, secular people as well, in support of Israel. And this is something completely new. It's exciting and it's dynamic and it's growing. And I'm truly honoured to be on the programme today, because East Anglia Friends of Israel, for me, epitomises what can be achieved in terms of the events that they've put on that you've seen as well, Simon. Really first-class events. Absolutely. Packed with people, lots of energy, lots of support, bringing in the Jewish community and showing them the love and support that there is for Israel. I think these Friends of Israel groups are making a huge difference.
And Jill, I know that Steve might be a little bit embarrassed here, but I don't mind embarrassing him. But can you share with us the help and the support that you've received personally from Stephen in helping to establish East Anglia Friends of Israel and to put on some of the incredible events you have over the last 2 years?
I can't honestly imagine doing it without Stephen's support and help, and he's just been instrumental in everything that's happened for us as a group. We certainly wouldn't have got going if it hadn't been for Stephen, and I think from that first time I met you, we clicked and our friendship began, and we've just really worked together ever since, which has been a privilege.
Fantastic. Yeah. There you go. You deserve that, Stephen. And Stephen, can you... I mean, what's so interesting about the establishment of East Anglia Friends of Israel is that it's all centred around the kind of blood libel in the medieval times. And sadly, the treatment of the Jewish people in this nation was horrific during the Middle Ages. And sadly, the blood libel came from here. You know, we saw the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. What do you think the attitudes of the why do you think the attitudes towards the Jewish people during the Middle Ages was so shocking, particularly as it was all done under the name of Christianity?
Well, I think in the Middle Ages, hatred of Jews was bound up in religion very largely. The Jews were castigated as Christ killers. They were, they were considered stubborn because they hadn't converted to Christianity. And really, at that time, the Jews being dispersed and persecuted was seen as a vindication of Christianity, very, very, very sadly. But what I think makes anti-Semitism so, I think, distinctive, really, is how something that was rooted in the Middle Ages doesn't go away, but it persists and it mutates over time. So this blood libel against the Jewish people, that in effect saying that the Jews killed Gentiles in order to satisfy their ritualistic needs as Jews, doesn't die in the Middle Ages. It goes across Europe. It's still present in the 20th century during the Nazi period. Obviously, it's revived. And even to this day, in much of the Arab world, the blood libel is still believed. And I think this is an example, really, of something evil which doesn't go away. It mutates and changes over time. And even in the West today, the depiction of Israel as bloodthirsty, as child-killing, this, I think, stems from this very, very powerful libel against the Jewish people, which very sadly, as you've said, dates back to England and more particularly to Norwich.
So let's have a look now and put all of this in its historical context of the history of the Jews during the Middle Ages and how this links to Britain's treatment of the Jews during that time.
The Persians weren't the only ones to overrun Jerusalem. The whole area of Palestine was taken by Muslim conquerors in 636 and 637. And this is when we date the start of the medieval period in Jewish history. In the medieval period, the Jews lived in a great many different places, scattered all around, but nearly always underneath some Islamic or Christian ruler. How they fared varied greatly depending on the ruler, and their position was always precarious. If the public or if the ruler changed their view of the Jews, they could lose everything. By around the year 1200, Jews were scattered in the following areas. First, they were across North Africa, including the cities of Alexandria, Egypt, and Cairo, Egypt. There were some down along the Nile. There were some down in what's today Ethiopia. At the time it was called Abyssinia, in what later became Yemen, in the part of the world where Muhammad was to start another world religion, in the area of their former kingdom, what had been called Judea and Palestine by the Romans. In many eastern areas, what used to be part of the Babylonian and Assyrian empires. And again, there were some in England, in many places in what became Spain and Portugal in the modern era, in France, in what became Germany, some parts of Italy, various portions of Eastern Europe, even a few on the west coast of India. That's roughly where they were then, right in the middle of the Middle Ages. During the medieval period, Jews were almost always what we would call second-class citizens. In Islamic lands, they were called dhimmis. That means protected peoples. Frankly, that's a euphemism. As dhimmis, they had fewer rights than regular citizens, and they had to pay a special tax, which could sometimes be onerous. In Christian lands, there were typically restrictions on marriage. Very often the Jews had to wear identifying clothing, marking them as Jews so that people knew who they were interacting with. And from the 11th century on, there were periodic pogroms. A pogrom is an organized persecution of an ethnic group. It's typically used to refer to violent outbursts against Jews. Oftentimes, these would be started by crazy rumors that the Jews were involved in ritual murder, that they were using the blood of Christian babies or Christian children to make their bread. These crazy rumors are called the Blood Libel. Again, there were rumors that the Jews had poisoned the well, that people in town were getting sick because the evil Jews had secretly put poison in there, or that the Jews had taken the host, the blessed bread of the Christian Eucharist, and desecrated it, thus desecrating the body of Christ. In a number of cases, these pogroms were carried out by crusading Christian armies, basically organized mobs on their way to join the Crusades, which we'll talk about in our unit on Christianity. In a number of cases, Christian bishops and kings tried to protect the Jews from these mobs, but only with limited success. Jews, sometimes hundreds and thousands of them, were murdered in various incidents. In some places in the Middle Ages, there were forced conversions, where rulers said, "Convert or die." And of course, when you do that, some people will convert, some people will die, and some people will pretend to convert in order to save their lives. By the year 1500, they had been expelled from much of Western Europe. Rulers, jealous of the Jews' money and property, would just decide to kick out the Jews and take all their stuff, and this happened repeatedly. These expulsions, mainly starting in the 1200s and continuing up to around 1500, led to an ethnic division among the Jews of the world. The Sephardim, or the Sephardic Jews, were exiles from Spain and Portugal, and they ended up settling mostly in the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The other group are called the Ashkenazim, or the Ashkenazi Jews. These are groups that fled to Eastern Europe, where they eventually developed Yiddish, a blend of German and Hebrew. This division, though, went back to earlier times. It wasn't created in the High Middle Ages. In our next and last segment of this lecture, the modern era of Judaism.
That's a brief overview of the history of the Jewish people during the Middle Ages. Jill, you know, being a Bible-believing Christian like you are as well, when we look at what happened to the Jewish people in the Middle Ages, all you can say is it's absolutely horrific, and the people that carried out these hideous crimes, such as the Blood Libel and attacks on the Jewish people, clearly didn't read the Bible and didn't have the Bible, because they didn't get that until the Reformation. Absolutely. So how much do we blame the leadership of the church at the time for the foul treatment of the Jewish people?
I think there was a lot of corruption. Of course, the Blood Libel began in Norwich, so that's a stigma that we've always felt over our city. In 1144, there was a young Christian boy called William, and rumour came out that the Jews had killed William for ritual purposes, for the Passover. We were going to use his blood in the Passover, which was crazy. At the time, the Jewish population in Norwich were tanners. They were quite a group of them in Norwich, but they were also money lenders. And from our research, we believe that may have been very instrumental in the fact that they were blamed for William's death, because Christians at the time couldn't loan money. So the Jewish people were money lenders. And I think that some of the buildings in Norwich were built with that money, and maybe they didn't want to pay the money back. So the Blood Libel came in as a way of blaming the Jews, so the money didn't have to be repaid. We can't be absolutely sure, but that's what our research has led us to believe.
Yeah. And Stephen, history is so important, isn't it? Because, you know, if we don't understand our past, then we don't understand the present. We certainly can't understand the future. But certainly a lot over the years has been done to bring about a reconciliation between the Jewish community and Christians, and particularly the work that was carried out when the Jews were allowed back into England under Oliver Cromwell. was a change in this nation's history for its good. Can you share with us very briefly the incredible contribution the Jewish community has made to this nation, to the success of this nation?
Well,
we could do with 5 programs.
Over many centuries. It's an amazing contribution in terms of culture, in terms of even entertainment and business, and in so many different ways. And spiritually as well, I believe the Jewish community has made a tremendous contribution to Britain in an environment of lots of tolerance. I think that's important to say, bearing in mind all the bad things that we've mentioned in the history of this country. Britain has been, by the standards of the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, a remarkable haven for Jewish people. Think of Jews from as refugees arriving here during the 20th century. Clearly not enough of them, because so many were left behind during the Holocaust, but those Jews who did come to the UK in the late 1930s also made their contribution over time. So I think it's an amazingly overwhelmingly positive story when you look at the modern history of the Jewish community here in the UK.
Excellent. So let's have a look now at the history of the Jews living in this land, the UK.
Hi, and welcome again to Agudas Shalom's This Week in Jewish History. Today, I'd like to give us a brief survey of the history of the Jews in medieval England. This week marks the anniversary of the death of King Henry I, who reigned in England from the year 1100 to 1135, when he died. King Henry was good to the Jews. He granted them many rights, including the right to move wherever they wished, the right to be tried by their peers, and the right to swear on the Torah instead of on a Christian Bible. This anniversary of the death of King Henry I gives us the opportunity to learn about the Jews in medieval England in general. The first records of a Jewish community in England date back from around the time of the Norman conquest in 1066. Throughout this period, the Jews established communities in Bristol, in York, in Canterbury, and of course in London. As in many Christian countries during the Middle Ages, many Jews were involved in money lending. Due to the Catholic prohibition against lending with interest, Jews often chose, and sometimes were forced, to occupy this profession. But despite Henry I's relatively benign reign, the Jews of medieval England suffered quite a bit. In 1141, in the town of Norwich, which you now see on your screens, we find the first recorded blood libel against Jews in history. The Jews of the town of Norwich were accused of murdering a Christian child named William and using his blood for ritual purposes on Passover. The Jewish community was attacked in response to these accusations, and as many of us know, this English invention, the blood libel, would tragically spread throughout Europe during the Middle Ages and beyond. In the year 1190, we come to another tragedy to hit the Jews of England. The Jews of York in northeastern England were attacked. Many of them fled to the castle in York, which you see on the top left, where they felt they would be protected. But the proprietor of the castle turned them over to the mobs, and approximately 150 Jews were killed. They chose death rather than become forcibly baptized. Here, on the bottom right, you have a monument to the victims of the York massacre, appropriately inscribed with a verse from the book of Isaiah, proclaiming that God's people will show his glory in the faraway islands, in this case, the British Islands. But let's not think that all of medieval Jewish English history was tragedy. Lesser known, perhaps, but very important, is that England was a major center of Torah scholarship, producing great rabbis who were counted amongst the authors of Tosafot, medieval commentaries on the Talmud. These great English sages included Rabbi Eliyahu of York, Rabbi Barachia of Lincoln, and most prominent amongst them, Rabbi Eliyahu Milundrish, or in English, Rabbi Elijah of London. The story of medieval English Jewry comes to its tragic close in the year 1290, when the entire Jewish community was expelled, most of English Jewry resettling in France and Germany. The Jews as a community would not be allowed back into England until the middle of the 17th century. Although historians still dispute this, many think that this was under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell, that you see on your left, and under the influence of Jewish leader Menashe ben Israel, who you see on your right. This permission given to the Jewish community would once again allow it to rebuild itself as the prominent Jewish community it has been since. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.
And that leads us on to this very, very important topic that we'll be discussing in today's programme. Jill, now something quite amazing happened or really changed Norwich, and that was the discovery of 17 bodies discovered in a medieval well in the city centre in 2004 during a regeneration project. Can you share with us the findings of these 17 bodies that were found in this medieval well?
I think for many of us, the first we knew about it was a programme that came on the television, a cold case programme that was called Bodies in the Well. And that threw light onto these 17 bodies who'd clearly been murdered. There were 11 adults and 6 children, and they had been brutally thrown down this well, whether the fall killed them or just because they couldn't possibly get out, we're not sure. But they did extensive research on these bodies, and it seemed quite certain that they were actually of Jewish descent. That would have been the only reason for the persecution, because even when people were diseased or anything like that, they would have been buried in Christian graves. So everything pointed to the fact that these bodies were Jewish. Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on this one, Stephen? The fact that here during in 2004 there's a regeneration of the city centre in Norwich, and then to find 17 bodies that were pushed down a well, and then finally finding out in 2011 that these were Jewish people through DNA.
Well, it's hugely moving. I think for any Jewish person, for anyone, actually, hearing about that story, that these bones had been discarded in such a horrible way, these bodies had been disposed of in such a horrible way, and centuries later, like in a time capsule, they're found, and their stories become known. They're not lost. We understand the story, we understand what happened a lot better. After so many centuries, it's just an incredible, incredible story.
Yeah. And Jill, when we're looking at this story, isn't it incredible that this has come to light in our day, and that this story of these poor Jewish people that were murdered has actually something incredibly good come out of it? Can you tell us the response and your involvement with this story?
To me, this really speaks very much of Ezekiel 37, can these bones live? And here were these bones buried for hundreds of years, and when they were finally brought out of the ground, they have really spoken to people in a very profound way. At first, the bones were taken to the Norwich Museum, and I got involved by working alongside a Jewish man called Clive Roth, who worked tirelessly to get these bones released from the museum. It was not easy for him. There was a great deal of opposition, because I think they particularly wanted it as an exhibit in the museum. And Clive felt very strongly that the last thing we could do for these poor people was to give them a proper burial. And throughout many, many challenges, he persevered. And it was a great privilege. I got to know him during this time, and to stand with the Jewish community and give them support, really, to see these bones released. And they were released. And the amazing story that happened around that was incredibly moving. I believe the curator of Norwich Museum, when those bones were actually released and Clive went to fetch them and put the tallit over the little boxes, because obviously they were just very small by this stage. I believe that he actually stood there with tears in his eyes as Clive was reciting psalms over these people as they were taken from the museum to the Jewish cemetery where they were buried. And we had an incredibly moving ceremony there. It was one of those days that you'll never forget. In fact, the sheriff at the time of Norwich, in history, the sheriff was the one who was meant to protect the Jewish people in Norwich going back to 1144. And the current sheriff was there at the burial. And I remember him saying that out of all his duties that he had done during the time of being a sheriff of Norwich, this was the most important.
Wow.
Yeah, it was incredible.
So let's have a look now at this extract of this BBC documentary, which is called History, a Cold Case, that looked into the discovery of the 17 bones that are found in this medieval well in the city of Norwich.
At the University of Dundee's Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, the History Cold Case team is embarking on a major new investigation.
Ladies, today's case, medieval Norwich. We've got disarticulated remains of at least 17 people.
Using a mobile forensic lab, the team has come to Norwich, where recent archaeological investigations have unearthed a major and chilling new find: the remains of 17 people at the bottom of a medieval well.
Disarticulated, which means we're not looking at single burials, so presumably it's a massed grave.
The bodies include men, women, and young children. The local community needs answers. Who were these people, and how did their remains end up down a well? The possibilities are horrific.
There's some debate as to whether the children were dead when they went down the well.
The investigation will be led by world-renowned forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black. Dr. Xanthi Mallet will gather historical evidence, while Professor Caroline Wilkinson will rebuild the faces of the dead. And the team is joined by DNA expert Dr. Ian Barnes.
I've got a team that is of world-renowned reputation, so that if we can't crack it, then, you know, who else can?
By forensically retracing events, analysing the scene of death, and reconstructing the identities of two of the skeletons, can we discover what happened to these people?
This is a really unusual situation for us. I think this is really unique.
And ultimately, might this case reveal the unthinkable, that they were killed?
You simply can't breathe because your chest is compressed.
We go back to a shocking period of widespread religious persecution and genocide.
They haven't applied normal Christian tradition. They've completely ignored it.
As the trail reveals new proof about one of the most shameful episodes in British history.
And if you want to watch the full episode, I can tell you what it's called. It's called History, Cold Case, the bodies in the well worth watching. How important is it, not only for the Jewish community in Norfolk, which is a very small community, Stephen, but also for British Jewry, that what happened here with the discovery of these bones and having a proper Jewish burial centuries later is so important?
Well, I think it's of national importance, indeed of international importance. It's true that the history of the Jewish community in England is kind of split. You have the Middle Age period, then you have a long period of expulsion with very few Jews living here, and then the readmission. So there is this, I think, ignorance on the part of many Jews in England today about that medieval history. Perhaps we would know the outline in terms of some of the more significant events, but this story of the bones, I think, was a reminder for the Jews of England that there is an older history of Jewish presence here, that it did have tragic elements to it. And so, yes, I think it was an extremely important incident really reminding and educating the Jewish community as much as anybody else about the medieval history of the Jews of this country.
And Jill, how has this brought about reconciliation between the Christian and Jewish communities in Norwich over the findings and the discovery of these 17 Jewish bodies and the reburial with the proper Jewish burial?
I think because when we started to give a lot of support to the Jewish community, I think that really helped build up relationship and build trust. And we had a cause to work together, and that was very important. And friendships, it's all about friendships, and they develop from there, really. And now many of us have very good friendships with the Jewish people in Norwich. Just a small community, but they're good friends, and we trust each other and support one another.
Excellent. So let's go and look at the final extract of this documentary called The Bodies in the Well.
What Xanthi learns from the charnel house makes the well burial even more confusing. Even during the worst outbreaks of disease, people were not just thrown into the nearest hole. The church taught that to be buried in a non-Christian way would lead to purgatory and hell. Medieval Norwich was a devout Christian city with over 40 parish churches. So, why weren't our 17 people buried with the usual care? Could it be because they weren't Christians?
This is not a Christian burial. So that do we have people who are not of the Christian faith? Is that why they're there? Or is it that they are some form of an outcast? Was it that people were afraid of them? I don't know, but they were not dealt with respect.
The stable isotope data are back, and the results are intriguing. What they reveal is that the people found down the well had lived in the local area for many years. They were not just visiting. The trail suddenly now points towards non-Christian locals. And there's only one significant community from the time that matches that profile. Since 1135, Norwich was home to a thriving Jewish community, living just a few hundred yards from the well site. Xanthi meets up with Sophie Cabot, a specialist in Norwich's Jewish history, to find out more about this community.
The Jewry in Norwich in the Middle Ages was in this position between the market and the castle. Right. The castle's just up there, obviously the market's behind us, and the properties owned by Jews were concentrated in the area from White Lion Street here, right up to Little Orford Street at the far end of this block.
Is the proximity of the Jewry to the castle important?
It is, yeah. I mean, Norwich is a royal castle.
Right.
They were in England at the invitation of the Crown.
Oh, I see.
And the Crown had direct legal control over them and their business.
The Jews of Norwich had a very specific role.
And why were they actually invited here by the king?
They were invited to lend money.
And that was that primary function?
Yeah. At the time, the Christian interpretation of the Bible didn't allow Christians to lend money at interest. It was a sin called usury. Certainly, that's something that's not forbidden in Jewish law. So cash finance for big projects of any sort came from Jewish finances.
Almost like banks?
Yeah, like banks, basically.
Does that mean they were all wealthy, then?
Some of them were extremely wealthy. There's one or two families who are incredibly rich and who are lending money on a national scale or even an international scale.
Xanthi and Sophie visit the house of Isaac Jernet, which still stands in central Norwich. Despite having financed the cathedral, like many Jews across Christian Europe, the Jernets may have been subject to persecution.
This is him here, shown at the top.
With a crown?
Wearing a crown, yes, showing how important he is, and also with three profiles, three faces. It seems to mean that he's into everything, that he's sort of got fingers in lots of pies.
Oh, I see.
And this is a caricature. This was drawn by a Christian, by a scribe in the Exchequer. they, as you can see, have rather caricatured faces, big noses. This is a hat that indicates that Moses is Jewish. They're not kind drawings.
No.
And they're shown with this little devil who is tweaking them on the nose.
Would you say that it's anti-Semitic? Because it's certainly not complimentary.
There's resentment of the fact that Jews are making money. Some Jews, like Isaac, are making a huge amount of money, and they're doing it in a way that doesn't involve physical labour or things that are necessarily recognised as work. You know, it's a bit like people feel about bankers now.
And sadly, the whole disease known as Jew hatred hasn't gone away even in this nation. But it's important that what we do is we raise awareness and historical awareness of evil that's taken place, so that can be rectified. Can you talk us through, Jill, about not only the reconciliation, but also the forgiveness aspect of this, of what happened under the name of Christianity?
Well, for us, obviously, it's been something that we've been really concerned about and repented much before God about, because it began a whole stream of persecution. And when it begins in your own city, that is something awful to actually overcome. And of course, Hitler actually quoted Norwich several times and drew from that. I believe also when he said when he was going to bring the Third Reich to England, he wanted to stand on the steps of City Hall in Norwich, which was obviously something he never did, and we're very pleased he didn't. So it's been a process of seeing how we can bring it to today and how relevant we can be today, and assure our Jewish community that Norwich is a good place for them and it's a sanctuary for them, and try and reverse some of the history that's gone before us. And that's really part of the reason why we feel so strongly about East Anglia Friends of Israel.
And Stephen, isn't it incredible that there was a blood libel, something was a historic murder that took place on the scale of kind of ethnic cleansing of England's precious Jewish community during the Middle Ages, has then resulted not only in reconciliation between Christians and Jews, but also helped to establish and develop East Anglia Friends of Israel. What does that say?
It's an incredibly positive story, and I hope a huge encouragement for the viewers who are watching. If they're living in East Anglia, I would certainly say encourage them to get involved with East Anglia Friends of Israel. If viewers are watching from other parts of the country, there are other Friends of Israel groups, as I've mentioned, from Scotland right the way down to the south coast. All of them bringing together Jews, Christians and others in support of Israel. And having attended East Anglia Friends of Israel events, I can say that, Jill, they are amazing, and the first one was very much based on the theme of William of Norwich and reconciliation. It really touched Jewish hearts. The members of the Jewish community who attended that event were extremely moved by it. And I think this shows the great value of Friends of Israel groups, that they can, at a local level, bring together different communities in a positive way where both Jews, Christians and others feel comfortable, and where it's blessing Israel and promoting that support for Israel. I think this is hugely important. There is so much hostility out there, let's be honest. We need to make sure that there is a positive noise for Israel in our country, and that this emerged in East Anglia from such a tragic story is, I think, hugely, hugely moving, and it is very, very encouraging. Out of blackness comes unconditional love, and I think unconditional love is one of the most powerful forces in our world today. We think about hate as being a force in our world today, but the kind of unconditional love that Jill and her team at East Anglia Friends of Israel and the people around her extend towards the Jewish community in Norwich has certainly melted hearts and had a huge impact.
Yeah. And Jill, can you talk us through the ceremony that took place with, I think, a plaque marking the site where 17 Jewish people were murdered, and I believe many of them were children as well, including mothers, in that horrendous blood libel. And I think we've got some footage now to show you.
Sure. Yeah, this was just outside the Chapel Field shopping centre, And that's where eventually they agreed to put up the plaque. The gentleman reading the paper right now is Clive Roth, who was the one who instigated the whole release of the bones. And just behind him, beneath that blue curtain that you can just see flapping in the wind there, is the actual plaque that went up at the shopping centre. It does give recognition to these poor people, and that's what we wanted to do. It took quite a long time to get the different authorities to agree the wording of that plaque, but thankfully it is there now for people to see. And there was a little ceremony there. We've got the mayors and sheriff and the bishop of the Interfaith in Norwich is standing there, and Alex, the minister of, he was the minister of the Jewish synagogue at the time.
Okay, very good. And can you share with us, Jill, the impact that this has had on the city of Norwich?
I think it's been very key, and going back to the very first event we had as East Anglia Friends of Israel, which was very much about signing the Shalom Declaration. And I mean, those of us that have supported Israel know that there's such a thin line between anti-Semitism and Israel, that the two merge very much together. And for our Jewish community, when they witnessed over 200 Christians coming forward to sign a document saying that they were going to stand with Israel and Israel had the right to exist, it meant so much to them. As Stephen has said, it was a very emotional evening. We literally could have passed boxes of tissues along the roads that night. There was something very, very special about it. And I think it was, to me, it felt like a reversal of what had gone on before.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Stephen, what are your views on creating this new chapter that we're seeing today that's really only really developed over the last 20 years or so, but is accelerating more and more so? And that is the wall that's breaking down, that has been up for centuries, thousands of years between Jews and Christians. And, you know, now if there's an event in Israel, we regularly see a lot of Jewish people as well as Christians, and there's that interaction between them, but also this new willingness for Christians to get practically active on behalf of Israel and to make their voices known, to write to their MPs, to correct misinformation in our mainstream media about the reporting of Israel, to attend rallies and also then to buy Israeli products.
Well, I think it's hugely significant, and it's happening globally. We see it here in the UK, but we see it across the world, in the United States in particular, but also in South America, wherever I think the Christian church is wedded to Hebrew scripture and appreciates that biblical understanding about Israel from a Christian perspective. There you see, I think, a greater coming together of Jews and Christians based on shared values, shared biblical values, which is extremely important. It doesn't mean that we have universal agreement on everything, of course not, but what we do have right across the world are Jews and Christians coming together. And in terms of that support for Israel, Christian support is hugely significant. When we had that event at the Royal Albert Hall commemorating the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, and it was full, it was a tremendous, I don't know how to explain it, but for the Jewish community to see the Royal Albert Hall full of people honouring the centenary of the Balfour centenary was a massive encouragement. That sense that we stand alone in this country, that we don't have friends when it comes to Israel, I think is disappearing because of Christian support. And when it comes to things like petitions and demonstrations, a growing percentage of those supporting those initiatives are coming not from the Jewish community but from the Christian community. And I think this is being recognised more and more in Israel itself. We're in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, one of the biggest caucuses, one of the biggest groups of representatives, members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, is to do with the Christian allies around the world to build on that relationship. So at the very highest level, from the Prime Minister and the President down in Israel, there's a growing recognition of this Christian support.
Absolutely. And it's very much a passionate love affair, isn't it? You only have to read the Bible to realise how much God loves Israel and the Jewish people, and you can't fail to respond. Sadly, many don't. But Jill, can you explain to us some of the activities that you do on behalf of East Anglia Friends of Israel and give our viewers a little bit more of an insight?
Yeah, I think one of the important things is that we can do is we can be a voice right now. And while we still are able to be a voice, we must take every advantage of that, because to me it seems as if we're being pressurized to not be a voice anymore, but we should still have that right. And we believe very much that it is Friends of Israel is being a proactive group. So it is going to your MP, it is speaking with your MP and sharing with your MPs how worried we are about this ridiculous rise in anti-Semitism that is just unjust and unfair, and to speak out against it. Generally speaking, the Jewish community in this country is a very peaceful, hard-working community. And the fact that it's risen, this anti-Semitism has risen up in this country is absolutely appalling. But we can stand up against it. We can go and speak to our MPs and lobby them. And every year there is a lobby day in Parliament. And so for the last few years, we've managed to get a coach full of people to go down and to make a stand there. And hundreds come, and it's a way of saying, you know, enough is enough, really. Also to complain about the very biased media that we have in this country. It is shocking the way that Israel is reported. It is unjust, it's unfair, and it's untruthful. And people seem to be taken in by it. And somebody has to say, no, this isn't true, this isn't right. And it is standing up for righteousness, I think. And as Christians, we ought to be doing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And Stephen, what would you say to those Christians watching this programme? And I have many friends in both Norfolk and also in Suffolk that should actually join and get involved in the excellent work with Jill and her team with East Anglia Friends of Israel.
Well, I think there are many Christians out there who are supportive of Israel. Sometimes they feel quite isolated because maybe they're in a church which doesn't share their particular insight and view. And I think for them to come together with hundreds of others, because it is hundreds of others who are attending East Anglia Friends of Israel events, it is hugely enriching and encouraging for them. So I would certainly encourage people to get involved. I think it is an excellent way to engage with the local Jewish community. It's a way to get active at the local level, because I think sometimes we try and leave it to others to stand up for Israel, maybe at a level of central government or at a very high level. But no, we can do things. We can do things in our own communities, in our own congregations and localities. And that, I think, is a tremendous lesson of East Anglia Friends of Israel and the other Friends of Israel groups which are growing across the country. So I think, yes, get involved in something which is dynamic, exciting, and I genuinely believe will enrich those who take part in it.
Absolutely. And Jill, you've got a couple of events you're organising in the autumn on behalf of East Anglia Friends of Israel. Do you want to share with us about that in the dying minutes of the programme?
Yeah. Basically, our mandate is to have 2 major events a year. In the autumn, the event is very much geared for the Christian community to educate them really on the need to support Israel. There are some in Christian churches who are very clearly against Israel, but most of them are actually on the fence and know nothing about it. So it's to encourage people who don't know very much, share with them what the scriptures say, and to encourage them that this is the right thing to do. So that would be more of a focus of our autumn event. And our spring event is to have speakers come where the Jewish community and the Christian community can come together in our support and love for Israel.
Absolutely. And Stephen, I have to re-emphasise this. Isn't it so important that Christians do more than to pray for Israel? And praying for Israel is extremely important. but so is standing with Israel and the Jewish people, particularly at this critical time where we're seeing that Israel's being attacked, and there's always that risk of a regional war just around the corner. Plus, we're seeing unprecedented levels of Jew hatred in this country, in Europe, and around the world.
Well, I think Jill mentioned it earlier. When we look back in the kind of the history of the 1930s and the Holocaust, unfortunately, too many people were silent. And I think when we look back on that, we don't want to repeat that. And I often say this: what begins by being against the Jews never ends by being purely against the Jews. This is about all our rights. It's our rights to believe what we believe, to pray the way that we want to pray. This is all at stake here. So again, I would say it is important to speak out, and East Anglia Friends of Israel and the other Friends of Israel groups are local platforms which will encourage and enable you to speak out at the local level.
Yeah, and just very briefly, Jill, can you share with us why it's so important that anyone living in Norfolk or Suffolk should be part of East Anglia Friends of Israel?
Well, we would just love to connect with anybody who's got a passion and an interest in Israel, and you'd be so welcome to come along to any of our events and to lobby with us and support us. So please get in touch, contact me, and we can get together and hopefully work together in this.
Jill, Stephen, thank you so much for being my guest on today's Middle East Report. And I think something incredible has happened with East Anglia Friends of Israel, coming out of a blood libel, coming out of a discovery of 17 bones that were found to be murdered at a medieval well, has resulted in the reversal of that blood libel and that horrendous crime that took place many centuries ago. So thank you so much for being my guest on today's program.
Thank you, Simon.
And I just want to thank you for watching today's Middle East Report. I think it shows us something very important, that when we see historical wrong in this crime against these Jewish people that were murdered because they were Jewish in medieval times, can then result in a blood libel, can then also then result in something so creative, something so supportive of Israel and the Jewish people, shows that this is something godly and this is something righteous and that we should all support. And so therefore it's only fitting that I should leave you with a song for the Israeli national anthem, the Hatikvah, in our support and dedication for the nation of Israel and the Jewish people at this critical time in world history.
Bye.